Life on Texas death row, inside the Allan B. Polunsky Unit prison. On March 19, 2013, at exactly 11:47 p.m., guards at the Allan B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas opened cell number B-18. What they found shouldn't have been possible. Inside the 6-by-9-foot concrete box that housed one of America's most notorious death row inmates, they discovered something that would trigger the largest security investigation in the prison's history. The man inside that cell had been in solitary confinement for over a decade, 23 hours a day, every day, with no physical contact with another human being. The psychological evaluation that followed revealed a mind transformed by isolation into something the examining psychiatrist called unrecognizable from the man who entered. This is the Allan B. Polunsky Unit, home to Texas death row, where over 200 men wait in concrete tombs for their execution date. What happens to the human mind in these conditions isn't just disturbing. According to mental health experts who've studied the facility, it's a form of psychological deterioration that challenges our fundamental understanding of punishment, justice, and what it means to be human. Some of these men committed unspeakable crimes. Others maintain their innocence, their appeals dragging on for decades. All of them exist in a state of isolation so extreme that the United Nations has called it torture. But to understand how it came to this, we need to go back. This video discusses real criminal cases involving death row inmates and contains mature themes related to violent crimes, the death penalty, and extreme isolation. It's intended for educational purposes and to examine the criminal justice system. Viewer discretion is advised. The evolution of death row. The Allan B. Polunsky Unit wasn't always Texas death row. When it opened in 1993, it was designed as a maximum security prison for the state's most dangerous offenders. That changed in 1999, when Texas moved all male death row inmates from the Ellis Unit in Huntsville to Polunsky. The reason? Texas was executing more people than any other state, and officials needed a facility specifically designed to house men awaiting execution in complete isolation. The architecture tells you everything you need to know about the philosophy. Polunsky was built with modern isolation in mind. Every cell is identical, 6 feet wide, 9 feet deep, 10 feet high. Solid steel doors with a narrow window slot. A steel bunk. A stainless steel sink and toilet combination. One shelf. That's it. No television. No radio. No contact with other inmates except through the walls. The facility houses death row inmates on multiple pods, each pod containing cells arranged in tiers. According to former warden descriptions, the design ensures that inmates can be controlled and monitored without ever requiring guards to physically touch them. Looking back, there were signs no one wanted to acknowledge. Mental health advocates had been warning about the psychological effects of long-term solitary confinement for decades. Studies from the 1950s and 60s showed that isolation beyond 15 days could cause permanent psychological damage. The United Nations Mandela Rules, adopted in 2015, specifically prohibit solitary confinement beyond 15 consecutive days, calling it torture. Yet Texas was building a system designed to keep men isolated for years, sometimes decades. The men who arrived at Polunsky came from every background imaginable. Some were career criminals who'd committed multiple murders. Others were first-time offenders convicted of particularly heinous crimes. A significant number maintained their innocence, their cases mired in appeals based on questionable evidence, inadequate legal representation, or claims of actual innocence. What they all had in common was this. The moment they entered Polunsky, they entered a world designed to erase their humanity piece by piece. Everything changed when the first inmates began showing signs of what psychiatrists call isolation-induced psychosis. The daily reality. Michael Yowell arrived at Polunsky in 2005, convicted of murdering his parents and grandmother in a drug-fueled rampage. By all accounts, he was a violent, unstable man when he entered. What happened to him over the next 8 years illustrates the systematic breakdown that occurs in death row isolation. Here's what a typical day looks like for a Polunsky death row inmate. You wake up, if you slept at all, in your concrete cell. The lights never fully turn off. There's always illumination, making circadian rhythms nearly impossible to maintain. At approximately 3 a.m., you hear breakfast trays sliding through the slots in steel doors up and down your pod. The sound echoes endlessly in the concrete corridor. You eat alone, sitting on your steel bunk or standing because there's no chair. For the next 23 hours, you will remain in this cell. You cannot see other inmates, only hear them through the walls. Some yell constantly. Others weep. Some bang on doors or walls for hours. The noise is relentless, a cacophony of human desperation that never stops. According to court documents from multiple lawsuits, the sound levels regularly exceed what OSHA considers safe for human exposure. At some point during the day, you'll be offered recreation. This means guards will escort you in handcuffs to a slightly larger concrete box, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with a metal grate ceiling open to the sky. You'll spend an hour there alone before being returned to your cell. This is your only time outside your cell most days. There's no exercise equipment, no basketball hoop, just concrete walls and sky. They didn't know it yet, but this isolation would fundamentally alter their brain chemistry. Neuroscience research has shown that prolonged social isolation affects the brain similarly to physical trauma. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making and emotional regulation, begins to atrophy. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, shrinks. Stress hormones remain chronically elevated, causing systemic damage to virtually every organ system. You cannot touch another human being. This detail haunts many death row inmates more than any other aspect of their confinement. No handshakes. No hugs from visiting family members, if family still visits at all. When you have contact visits, which happens rarely and only after extensive background checks for visitors, you speak through a glass barrier using a phone. You can see your mother, your child, your spouse, but you cannot reach out and touch them. For years. For decades in some cases. The psychological toll manifests in predictable ways. Some inmates develop elaborate routines to maintain sanity, exercising in their cell, memorizing books, studying law. Others deteriorate rapidly. Court records document dozens of cases of inmates who developed severe mental illnesses during their time on Polunsky's death row. They hear voices. They stop eating, believing their food is poisoned. They smear feces on their cell walls. They attempt suicide repeatedly. What seemed like a minor detail would become crucial evidence in the lawsuit that followed. Mental health services at Polunsky are minimal. According to testimony from former prison psychiatrists, inmates experiencing psychiatric emergencies might wait days for evaluation. Medication is distributed through the door slot. Therapy sessions, when they occur at all, happen through the cell door with the inmate standing inside and the clinician standing outside. The idea of developing therapeutic rapport under such conditions is absurd. But what happened next would change everything. The breaking point. Andre Thomas's case epitomizes the horror of housing severely mentally ill inmates in death row isolation. Thomas was convicted in 2005 of murdering his estranged wife and 2 children in an act of psychotic delusion. He believed they were demons. During his first week in county jail, before even arriving at Polunsky, Thomas removed his right eye with his bare hands. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. He was still sentenced to death. When Thomas arrived at Polunsky, prison officials knew he was severely mentally ill. They placed him in isolation anyway. It's where all Texas death row inmates go. In 2008, while in his cell on death row, Thomas removed his remaining eye and ate it. When guards found him, he was blind, covered in blood, and calmly explained that he needed to prevent the government from reading his thoughts through his eyes. The decision would haunt officials forever. Thomas's case sparked national outrage and renewed questions about executing the mentally ill. But he remained on death row, blind and psychotic, in his isolated cell. This wasn't an isolated incident. Court documents reveal dozens of similar cases, men with serious mental illness deteriorating in isolation. Billy Vickers developed such severe depression that he stopped eating and drinking, dropping to under 90 pounds before prison officials force-fed him. Scott Panetti, diagnosed with schizophrenia, defended himself at trial while wearing a purple cowboy outfit and attempted to subpoena Jesus Christ and John F. Kennedy as witnesses. He was sentenced to death and sent to Polunsky despite clear evidence of severe mental illness. By the time legal advocates began mounting serious challenges, the psychological damage to many inmates was irreversible. Federal courts received testimony from psychiatrists who examined death row inmates at Polunsky. Their findings were consistent and disturbing. Prolonged isolation was causing serious mental illness in previously stable inmates and catastrophically worsening conditions in those who entered with mental health issues. Little did they know, the legal battle would expose systemic failures that went far beyond individual cases. The investigation and legal battles. In 2014, a class action lawsuit challenged conditions on Texas death row. The evidence presented painted a devastating picture. Expert witnesses testified that the isolation at Polunsky exceeded anything justified by security needs. Inmates who posed no disciplinary problems remained in solitary confinement simply because that's where death row inmates were housed. There was no individualized assessment, no consideration of mental health needs, no path to less restrictive housing. Prison officials defended the practice. They argued that death row inmates required maximum security and isolation to prevent violence, escape attempts, and disruption. They pointed to the serious nature of the crimes these men had committed, murders, often brutal and calculated. They claimed that any less restrictive environment would pose unacceptable risks. But witnesses testified to a different reality. Former corrections officers described a system where isolation was the default, regardless of individual behavior. One retired guard testified that he'd worked at Polunsky for 7 years and never witnessed a serious assault by a death row inmate. The violence officials feared wasn't materializing, yet the isolation continued. Conflicting accounts emerged about the true purpose of the isolation. Some officials suggested it was about punishment, that men sentenced to death deserved the harshest possible conditions. Others claimed it was purely about security. Mental health experts testified that neither justification held water. Isolation of this severity served no legitimate penological purpose and actively undermined any possibility of rehabilitation or human dignity. The investigation revealed something far more sinister. Internal documents showed that prison officials were aware of the mental health crisis on death row. Suicide attempts were common, far more common than in the general prison population. Medical records documented the progression of isolation-induced mental illness. Yet the system remained unchanged. In 2017, Texas made modest reforms. Death row inmates could now have limited access to some personal property, a radio, for example. They could have brief, supervised group recreation once a week. These changes, while an improvement, didn't address the fundamental problem, the near-total isolation that defined their existence. But the story doesn't end there. The human cost. To understand the real impact, you need to hear from the men who've lived it. Clinton Young arrived on Texas death row in 2003 at age 22, convicted of capital murder. He would spend over 15 years in isolation at Polunsky before his death sentence was overturned in 2018. In interviews after his sentence was commuted, Young described the psychological breakdown he witnessed in himself and others. "You start talking to yourself," Young explained. "Not just thinking, actually having conversations out loud. You pace back and forth, which is about 3 steps in any direction. You count things. Some guys count every brick in their cell. You lose track of time. Days blend together until you don't know if it's Tuesday or Saturday. You forget what your mother's voice sounds like. You forget what it feels like to shake someone's hand." This decision would haunt families as much as inmates. Visiting death row at Polunsky means traveling to a remote location in East Texas, going through extensive security screening, then sitting in a booth to speak with your loved one through glass via a phone for an hour or 2. Many families simply stop coming. The emotional toll is too great, the cost too high, the distance too far. Inmates gradually lose contact with the outside world, their support networks eroding year by year. Some men find ways to maintain their humanity. They study law, filing appeals and writs. They read voraciously, Books can be checked out from the prison library and are delivered to cells. They write letters, maintaining connections with pen pals and supporters on the outside. They exercise obsessively, doing push-ups and running in place for hours. They create art, writing poetry, or drawing with the limited materials available. Others descend into madness. Guards describe finding inmates who've stopped speaking, who rock back and forth for hours, who've scratched messages into their skin or carved designs into their cell walls with their fingernails. Medical records show inmates who've lost significant amounts of weight, who refuse to leave their cells even for recreation, who've attempted suicide multiple times. What happened at 6:24 p.m. on July 18, 2018, would exemplify this tragedy. Joseph Garcia, a death row inmate at Polunsky since 2000, was found hanging in his cell. He'd used strips torn from his sheet. It was his third suicide attempt. The previous two had been interrupted by guards. This time, they were too late. Garcia left a note describing the unbearable loneliness and his belief that execution would be preferable to continued isolation. He never got his execution date. He died by his own hand after 18 years in solitary confinement. The evidence uncovered would shock even veteran advocates. Between 1999 and 2019, at least 12 death row inmates at Polunsky died by suicide or died from complications of mental illness and self-harm. This was separate from the men who were executed. These were inmates who couldn't survive the wait. After approximately 8 to 10 years in isolation, inmates undergo what psychiatrists call social death. They lose the ability to engage in normal conversation. They become hypersensitive to stimuli. A guard's voice becomes overwhelming. The sound of keys jangling causes panic attacks. They lose social skills entirely, forgetting how to make eye contact, how to modulate their voice, how to interpret facial expressions. Even if they're later released from death row, they're often psychologically incapable of functioning in normal social environments. The execution process. When your execution date finally arrives, if it arrives, the process follows a rigid protocol. You're moved from your death row cell at Polunsky to the Huntsville Unit, where Texas carries out executions. For some inmates, this is the first time they've left Polunsky in years or decades. The move happens days before execution. You're placed in a holding cell near the death chamber. For the first time in years, you might have more frequent contact with staff, with chaplains, with prison officials preparing you for what comes next. Some inmates describe this period as almost peaceful. The waiting is finally over. Texas executes inmates by lethal injection. The process is supposed to be clinical, humane. In reality, numerous executions have been documented with complications, inmates gasping, thrashing, taking much longer to die than expected. But from the state's perspective, it's more humane than the electric chair or gas chamber used in earlier eras. The truth was far darker than anyone imagined. Many death row inmates at Polunsky never make it to execution. Some die of natural causes. Texas death row has men who've been there for 30 or 40 years, aging into their 60s and 70s in isolation. Others, like Garcia, die by suicide. Still others have their sentences overturned on appeal and are removed from death row, though they often remain in prison serving life sentences. For those who are executed, their time at Polunsky shapes their final moments. Some men become so psychologically damaged by isolation that they're barely coherent during their execution. Others seem almost relieved. The endless waiting, the psychological torture of isolation, is finally ending. Where are they now? As of 2024, approximately 200 men remain on Texas death row at the Allan B. Polunsky Unit. Their cases span decades. Some arrived in the early 2000s and are still fighting appeals. Others arrived recently and face decades of isolation before any resolution. Texas continues to lead the nation in executions, though the pace has slowed in recent years. Between 1999 and 2024, Texas has executed over 300 death row inmates, most of whom spent years at Polunsky before their execution. The men we've discussed have vastly different fates. Andre Thomas, the man who removed and ate both his eyes, remains on death row as of this writing. his execution has been repeatedly stayed due to questions about executing someone so clearly mentally ill. He continues to live in isolation, blind, psychotic, and awaiting death. Clinton Young, whose death sentence was overturned, was resentenced to life in prison. He's no longer in death row isolation but remains incarcerated. In interviews, he's described the psychological scars from his years on death row as permanent. He still has nightmares, panic attacks, difficulty trusting others. Scott Panetti, the schizophrenic man who represented himself at trial, has had his execution stayed multiple times based on his mental incompetence. He remains on death row, in and out of psychiatric crisis, his case emblematic of the ongoing debate about executing the mentally ill. What they found next would change everything for some families seeking closure and justice. DNA evidence has exonerated several Texas death row inmates in recent years. Anthony Graves spent 12 years on death row at Polunsky before being exonerated and released in 2010. He describes his time there as a living hell and has become an advocate for criminal justice reform. His case raised disturbing questions. How many innocent men have suffered in Polunsky's isolation? How many might have been executed despite their innocence? No one could have predicted what would happen with the broader reform movement. As of 2024, several states have abolished the death penalty entirely, citing concerns about wrongful convictions, racial bias, and the psychological toll of death row. Texas has not joined them. The death chamber at Huntsville remains operational. Men continue arriving at Polunsky, beginning their years or decades of isolation. The ongoing debate. To this day, no one can fully reconcile the moral complexity at the heart of death row isolation. The men at Polunsky committed terrible crimes, murders that devastated families, acts of violence that shocked communities. Victims' families often support the death penalty, believing it's the only appropriate punishment for taking an innocent life. They attend executions to witness justice for their loved ones. But the investigation revealed something far more complicated. Creating suffering through isolation doesn't undo the crimes. It doesn't bring victims back. It doesn't make communities safer. What it does is create a separate class of victims. Men whose mental and physical health deteriorates under conditions international bodies consider torture. Some argue that these men deserve whatever suffering comes to them. They showed no mercy to their victims, so why should society show mercy to them? This perspective is understandable, particularly from victims' families who've experienced unimaginable loss. Others argue that the measure of a just society isn't how it treats its best citizens, but how it treats its worst. That executing mentally ill inmates or housing men in torturous conditions for decades says more about us than about them. That we can hold people accountable for horrific crimes without descending into cruelty ourselves. The evidence they uncovered would shock even veteran human rights advocates who thought they'd seen everything. United Nations investigators who've examined solitary confinement practices worldwide have specifically cited Texas death row as among the worst examples. The conditions at Polunsky exceed even those in supermax prisons in terms of isolation severity and duration. Mental health professionals remain united in their assessment. Prolonged isolation of the type practiced at Polunsky causes lasting psychological damage and meets the clinical definition of torture. The American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and numerous other professional organizations have condemned long-term solitary confinement. Yet the practice continues, supported by public opinion that largely sees death row inmates as deserving of harsh conditions and by political leaders who view reforming death row as politically risky. Conclusion. This case reveals something fundamental about how we administer justice in America. The Allan B. Polunsky Unit represents the intersection of our harshest punishments, death and isolation. It's where we send people we've decided don't deserve to remain in society, and it's where we subject them to conditions that systematically destroy their psychological well-being while they wait years or decades for execution. The question we're forced to confront is this. What does justice actually mean? Does it mean inflicting maximum suffering on those who've caused suffering? Does it mean upholding human dignity even for those who violated others' dignity? Can we maintain death row conditions that international experts call torture while claiming to be a just and humane society? There are no easy answers. The crimes committed by many Polunsky inmates are horrific and deserve serious punishment. Victims' families deserve justice and closure. Communities deserve safety. But the systematic psychological destruction of human beings through extreme isolation serves none of these goals. It doesn't make us safer. It doesn't heal victims' families. It doesn't deter crime. What it does is create suffering for suffering's sake. Over 200 men remain in those concrete cells right now, today, this moment. 23 hours a day in isolation. Years or decades stretching ahead of them. Some guilty beyond any doubt. Some possibly innocent. All experiencing conditions designed to break the human spirit. The system continues because it's politically easier than reform, because many believe these men deserve no better, because we'd rather not think too carefully about what happens behind those concrete walls in Livingston, Texas. But history will judge us by how we treat even those we deem most unworthy of treatment. The conditions at Polunsky will be part of that judgment. The final question remains, is this justice, or is this something else entirely? This channel covers the cases and conditions the system doesn't want examined too closely. Subscribe for weekly investigations into criminal justice, true crime, and the realities of America's prison system. Next week, we're examining death row in other states to see if Texas is an outlier or if this is the norm. You won't want to miss it. What do you think? Does death row isolation serve justice? Or has it become cruel and unusual punishment? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this case made you think differently about the death penalty or prison conditions, let me know what changed your mind. These conversations matter.